Lamar kind of gave me credit for coming up with having the Father's Day program, but actually it was Preston Kay's idea, who not only seems to bring all the guests, but has a lot of the ideas for programs and so forth. So one of the things I always did is I go to the source of all knowledge, the internet, and found a wonderful excerpt on the origins of Father's Day, and that is actually on your tables, and I think it's certainly worth reading, but I want to mention a couple of things. The idea of Mother's Day has been around really longer than the idea of Father's Day, and Miss Sonora Smart Dodd was listening to a sermon in 1910 in the early times about Mother's Day, and she realized in her own family it was her father, who was a Civil War veteran, that had really raised the family and had been the primary parent in the child raising. So she sort of started the idea that there ought to be a Father's Day, and it gained a lot of support over the years. But the piece you have will talk about different people that celebrated it, pushed for it, and so forth. But it didn't immediately catch on, and one of the reasons was Congress, who sort of has to, I guess, declare national holidays, thought that since they were all men at the time, that making a Father's Day was sort of like giving themselves, or would be seen, I guess, politically, as giving themselves a congratulatory pat on the back. So Father's Day, though it seems like Mother's and Father's Day has been around forever, it was actually not, did not come in as a national holiday until the presidency of Richard Nixon. So I just want to let you know that anytime you're playing Trivial Pursuit and they ask, why was Richard Nixon famous? Certainly it was for the establishment of Father's Day. So in all seriousness, our program today, we have 4 presenters of our own club. I always love programs like this. It's just like Gary last week. Gary, and I'm so sorry I missed that. But I'm glad it's on YouTube, though. And I understand it's getting close to 1 million hits now. Is that correct? But we have 4 of our own members who have some remembrances of their fathers, and I'm looking forward to this because it's going to be terrific. And the other thing, besides the tribute to the fathers, I think it gives all of us an opportunity to get more into an insight on our own friends here in Rotary. So I'm going to ask Jim Stump to start us off, and then we've got, I think everybody sort of knows their succession, David, and then Lamar, and then Kay's going to wrap us up. Jim?
Very good. I have to work that here. Good afternoon, everybody. Among my first memories, earliest memories of Dad, was that he took me over to a small branch line of the Norfolk and Western Railway to see a steam engine and to see it work. And I do remember it, and very, very well. The engineer were shuffling some boxcars. What a glorious machine that was, hissing and puffing, roaring. It was almost alive. I brought along a few slides, and Jonathan, I said I would mention this. This slide projector is older than Jonathan Black. So if the ball burns out, bear with me. We will find another way to continue. Dad worked in the Norfolk and Western shops in Roanoke. And that's the way they looked. And they kind of look that way today. They were built in the late 1800s. They were cold and drafty. Dad worked in the passenger car shop in the coach yard. We'll see a little bit more of that in just a second. But it was cold where he worked most of the time. And so I brought along his shop coat. This was about a 60-year-old jacket. And he needed it for most of the time during the winter. That's what he worked on. Passenger trains, passenger cars. That was the Norfolk and Western's best passenger train, the Powhatan era, leaving Roanoke headed west for Cincinnati. One of their steam engines, very quickly, getting ready to go in front of Hotel Roanoke. Some of you may remember Hotel Roanoke if you've ever been there. That's the coach yard again on the right. The shops, they're getting ready to do an engine change. These pictures are from 1957 and 1958. Again, you can see the second steam engine getting ready to come in there. Those are baggage cars. Dad worked under, around, and through, and most of those cars had wooden floors. He was a carpenter by trade. He worked for the Norfolk Western, now Norfolk Southern Corporation, for almost 41 years, primarily in the passenger car shop and the coach yard. He did some time in the drafting department, but really didn't like that at all. He rather worked with his hands. He liked to be in an unconfined area. And as you can imagine, his work had to be right. You really don't want something to go awry because of shoddy workmanship when you're traveling along at 60 miles an hour. Dad was emphatic about doing it right. Doing it right the first time. And he constantly preached to me, don't just slap it together. That's the first life lesson he taught me. His second life lesson was also a very straightforward piece of advice and wisdom. He said, take a walk. Or said differently, slow down. Why are you always in such a hurry? He loved his walks and continued them well into his 80s. His doctor said those walks kept him alive. Well, today I find myself walking. Actually taking some time to slow down. Not being totally successful, but working at it. Finally, Dad had a love of poetry, and especially of writing poetry. I've never developed that same love. But as I get younger, I have come to fully appreciate the significant value of writing. Dad made me practice my spelling incessantly. Do and redo my English papers and assignments, and would ultimately review my final drafts. Dad and some very good teachers made my life absolutely miserable. But as fate would have it, I am most grateful because writing became an important part of what I did for a living. And I look back, Dad, you were right. And I am most grateful for your patience, your persistence, yes, your threats, and your expertise. In closing, a few weeks ago at the North Carolina Transportation Museum in Spencer, they had a railpan weekend. I won't bore you with the story, but they had to borrow some passenger cars because they ran 3 different trains. One of those cars was number 511, ordered by the Norfolk and Western in 1949. It's likely the first car on that train, which is hard to see there because that was a crew car. It's very likely that Dad worked on that car because he worked on all the passenger cars that they had. And today it survives, still holding people at the tender young age of 63. Well, don't slap it together. Do it right the first time. Take a walk. And write. But do it right. Thank you. It is now my great privilege and pleasure to turn it over to David Kirkpatrick.
Thank you, Jim. My father grew up in a very small town in Cesar, Illinois. We're talking major small folks. And for Dad, a great dream come true was to go to a big city like New York. And I guess to some degree, over the years, he spent a lot of time in New York working with political, business, religious leaders, not only in the U.S. but around the world. It's probably no surprise that one of Daddy's favorite magazines was the New Yorker magazine. I don't know if you've ever read it, but it's great articles. But what really is phenomenal is the cartoons. Just amazing. I'm going to share a cartoon with you that Dad used in one of his Father's Day sermons many years ago. This is the scene. There's a overstuffed father sitting in an overstuffed chair sitting with a beer can in his hand and a lot of empties around him watching TV. He's comfortable, he's happy. Got the picture? And behind him is a mother. She's up there slaving away, ironing shirts, right and left. All this pressure, all these, it was just obvious that she was working herself to death. And there's a young son looking at this picture. He comes up with a very important comment and question. He said, "Mommy, Santa Claus provides us presents. The stork brings babies. Uncle Sam brings Social Security, and the Lord provides our daily bread. The question is, why do we keep getting?" Good question. And I think all of us would look back upon the life lessons that we learned from our dads. When I was a little boy, I was walking with Dad in the North Georgia mountains. We had a cabin up there, and it was great because I was born and raised in Atlanta, the big city, and being up in the mountains was just a great new world for David. As we walked along the path, I noticed the leaves started to move, and I got scared because I thought, oh my gosh, it's a snake, it's going to get me. And Dad calmly went over, moved the leaves away, and picked up a turtle. And as soon as he held that turtle, obviously the head and the legs just sort of disappeared into the shell. And as a young man, I thought, how cool is this? To have your house on your back, so that when you're ever scared, you can crawl into your shell. Dad takes a look at it as an opportunity to teach his son a life lesson. He said, "David, for this turtle to survive, he needs to risk and stick his neck out. Only by taking risk can he feed himself. The turtle has to live in a much bigger world than what's on his back." How true is that? Think in terms of your world. How big is your world? Dad always said that we all have a tendency to pull within, to get in our comfort zone, because it's comfortable, it's safe, it's secure. But it is in this small world is where we don't learn anything, we don't risk anything. And he always encouraged me and my brother and all the members of his church, you have to live in a bigger world. Because with living in a bigger world, you'll learn so much more about yourself and about others. You have an opportunity to serve others in this bigger world. You have an opportunity to inspire people in a bigger world. How big is your world? I think Mom and Dad were very proud of Jan and I when we made the decision years ago that we were going to make a point to have 2 homes in 2 different countries. Yes, there's a lot of similarities, but oh boy, there's a lot of differences as well. And because of that, I feel that our world has gotten so much bigger. And finally, one last lesson. Dad always said that life's not easy. You'll have struggles in your life. But he added to it, but David, always look to the joy that there is in the struggle. And I don't think we usually think in terms of that. I mean, struggling is hard work. It's a lot of disappointment. It's a lot of failure. But what Dad was saying is through the struggle, you have an opportunity to stand up for what you believe. You have an opportunity to serve others. You have an opportunity to do what needs to be done for the betterment of all. There is joy in our struggle, but sometimes we have to look for it. But if you look for it, you'll be absolutely surprised that you may find it, because that's something to celebrate. I just got to mention one last thing. Kay, you know, the show of hands, that's dangerous. And let me tell you why. Dad was invited to preach in Atlanta, Georgia, to about 800 gay and lesbian congregation. And to support Dad, my brother and I all went. And it happened to be Father's Day Sunday. So the preacher said, we're so glad to have Dal Kirkpatrick here, and we want to give out flowers to all the fathers that are in the audience. Please raise your hand. 3 hands went up. Dad, my brother, and myself. We ended up with about 3 dozen roses each. So you have to be careful about that going forward. But it's a pleasure to get an opportunity to share a little bit about my dad. His shoes could never be filled, but the steps he took gave me a direction. Thank you very much. Who's next?
You wonder why I have this in my hand. If I don't have some checkpoints, I'll talk too long. My father, Earl Lamar Gunter, had a hard life. His family followed a sawmill from North Georgia to Alabama and finally to Valdosta, Georgia, where I was born. Dad only attended school for 3 years. That was his total education. He went to work when he was an early teenager in the sawmill. I guess that was before child labor laws. And I don't know when it happened, but somewhere along the line, he learned to fire a boiler. And he did that for most of the rest of his life. Believe me, that's hard work. He worked at the sawmill first, then he got a job with TNR, which produced turpentine and other related products. But the job was the same, firing a boiler. And there he was firing it with wood chips that he scooped into the firebox. In 1940, he was lucky enough to get on with the Southern Railroad and as a fireman. And that was the best job he ever had in his life. And when I was about 9 years old, he took me on a trip to Palatka, Florida with him on a mixed freight, part freight cars, part passenger cars. And I was back in one of the passenger cars, and about 40 miles south of Valdosta, they stopped to drop a car, and he came back to the passenger car and got me and took me up to the engine. He and the engineer both would have gotten in trouble if they'd ever gotten back to the authorities that he did this. But all the way from there to Palatka, I sat in the fireman's seat. Of course, the fireman doesn't get to sit much because when you're firing a steam engine boiler, you're shoveling coal pretty fast. And I got a chance to see close up how hard my father worked. Unfortunately, in 1948, the Southern started employing diesels, and of course, as a result, they didn't need as many firemen. So he eventually lost his job on the railroad because of that. And so he went back to a sawmill, actually a lumber company, and went to firing a boiler again for the sawmill. And again, he's scooping wood chips and other wood debris into the firebox. He did that for the next several years, and during my high school years, there was one stretch he worked 7 days a week for almost a year. And unfortunately, I don't know whether this led to it or not, but it certainly didn't help. He had a mental breakdown and wound up spending the next 14 months in a mental hospital while I was in high school. Eventually, he was able to be released from the hospital, and he went back to a sawmill. But this time, he didn't go back to firing a boiler. He went to other jobs in the sawmill. And on one cold morning, operating a bandsaw, he took this part of his right hand off, 3 fingers, not the whole fingers, but the last joint. And that gives you an idea of the kind of work that people in sawmills do. And I was already in college at one point during this stretch of his work life, and I think he wanted to convince me that I needed to get my education. So he got me a summer job in the sawmill. And Luckily, the foreman took pity on me and put me on the green chain, which meant I just walked all day on the boards, marking the clear side if it had a side that didn't have knots on it. And I got pulled off the green chain one day because it was down, and I was taken out to help load a boxcar. In South Georgia, in the middle of the summer, a dark boxcar accumulates quite a bit of heat. So if I ever had any thought of quitting college, that would have discouraged me real quickly. But luckily I finished the summer on the green chain. That was the only day I had to work as hard as a lot of the folks at the sawmill did. But anyway, Dad and I never had many father-son talks. He taught mostly by example. He never drank alcohol, he never smoked, and he seldom cursed, an occasional damn or hell. But that was about it, and that was pretty rare. And usually it startled us when we heard it because it was used so seldom. He worked hard to provide for his family. He gardened extensively to help with the food budget. And even though he only had a third grade education, he encouraged all of us, my brother and my sister and myself, to get an education. Excuse me. With that limited education, he read the Valdosta Daily Times from cover to cover every day, and he read his Bible. And that was about the extent of the reading he did. Excuse me. He was a man of his word. If he promised you he would do something, whether it was promising a family member, a neighbor, somebody at the church, whatever, he would do what he said he would do. He loved his family and his grandchildren and showed that love. And that may have been the best example he provided us. Thank you. Okay?
Thank you, Lamar. Oh, hold on. We have props. A balancing act here. Bear with me. Okay, now I'm set. And I apologize, but like Lamar, I'm going to read, so bear with me. This will take a minute, but I'm going to look at John Luke in case I get a little too nervous. But first of all, thank you. I wanted, for all the speakers, that was really great. And there are similarities and differences that I've heard, and so this will be another one. Okay, yes, I see the time. Okay. First, I want to paint a picture of my father. So just to give you the kind of visual, all right, my father was all of 5'2". You would probably describe him as a wiry little man with brown hair, brown eyes, imagine that. He weighed 120 pounds, oh, small man. But with that, okay, how many of you remember Barney Fife and Andy Griffith, okay? If you put a police uniform on my father, that would be my dad. So, you kind of got the picture. From both his energy level, his size, we just wished he had that much talent. But he loved to tell stories. He had a huge imagination. His imagination was endless. So I don't believe he would have passed the first of the rotary four-way test all the time. Is it the truth? Probably not. But he was a very hardworking man, as in lots of energy. At night, after he would come home after working in the mill all day, he'd come home, he would chop wood, he would mow the lawn. Energy just galore, always working. A hard manual labor from sun up to sundown. My father was an extrovert. He liked people. He considered everyone his friend. His friends were his neighbors, local farmers. He and my mother respected everyone. Even though they grew up in a time where people of color were not always treated as well as white folk. But I have to give my parents credit. They treated everyone with kindness. their best friends were black. And I just love that about them. I thought we didn't have housekeepers, we didn't have maids, we didn't have help. To them, all people were the same. So we didn't grow up knowing racism, bigotry, or prejudice in our home. It was just a good family. But my father, okay, Lamar, also worked at a local mill. So his income was clearly not a lot, but even with the modest income, he was a generous man. He would give away everything, and I do mean everything. He would give you the shirt off his back. He would give anybody anything if they needed it. My mother, all of 5'3", she had the conservative quality, so she had to be the thrifty member of the family, and so I hope and think I got some of the service qualities from my father, and hopefully living within my means from my mother. One of my favorite memories, and I'll talk memories for a second, was when my father came home one night and he had a gift for us. Gifts were rare, but this one was so special. I could see in his face, he was beaming, just so excited. He had a puppy in his coat. And when he pulled this little brown puppy out of the coat, that was probably the most exciting thing we ever got. We named her Brownie, how original. She was with us for years. And that was probably the single's greatest gift we ever had. And okay, talk about education. My father was not well educated, but he valued education. And he wanted his daughters to get a good education. My mother didn't work, so they both assumed and aspired for their daughters to become good housewives and mothers. Oh well, guess I didn't reach the potential there with a failed marriage and no kids. Oh, but they were still proud of me, and they are still proud of my sisters. So in fact, the two things that he was most proud of in his life were his honorable discharge from World War II and his daughters, in that order. He was a cook in the Army during World War II, and I think that was because actually no one trusted him with a gun. But my father loved to fish, and at times he hunted, but that was just for like squirrels or rabbits, but never deer. And the last time I saw my dad, he did not know who I was, but he knew that I was somebody in his childhood. And so he grabbed me by the hand and said, "Let's go fishing." And we started walking down the hall to some imaginary bridge or river that was in his mind, because he wanted to go fishing. As you know, or may know, my dad died with Alzheimer's 18 years ago. That was my last memory of walking away to go fishing. So how does a tattered Kentucky Fried Chicken box represent my father or his life? When my sister and I moved my mother from her home in January to assisted living, we found this box. And my sister and I looked inside, and there's this wallet, which has a driver's license and a Sears credit card, and his honorable discharge, copy, laminated, and a packet of Camel cigarettes and some matches. That's probably the only possessions he had when he died. And my mother kept that. So what this represents is that he didn't value worldly treasures. He didn't hoard money or possessions. He gave everything away. He was not one to think this is just so exciting, the world we live in, and build homes. He gave it away. This is what he had when he died. His treasures were his family and his friends. And that, to me, is what I got out of my father. Thank you.